Look, it's been very much a mixed bag. You couldn't say that the region, broadly speaking, was delighted by AUKUS or by the prospect of Australia obtaining nuclear-powered submarines. But it's also true to say that many countries in the region, broadly speaking, are pretty much at ease with it. And look, unsurprisingly, perhaps the main barometer here is, basically broader geopolitics. How comfortable countries feel about US power in the region, how comfortable they feel about US allies exerting more power in the region. That tends to be the key measuring stick for how countries have reacted. So, unsurprisingly, perhaps countries like Japan have publicly come out in favour of AUKUS. They've said quite openly they're very much at ease with it. Taiwan itself has also welcomed the move. Other countries are a little bit more cautious about expressing any sort of public support for AUKUS, but they're also definitely not criticising it. So countries like India, South Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, all of these countries might not be issuing press releases saying that they're delighted by AUKUS. They certainly don't want to wade into a fraught geopolitical situation, but they're also not sharply critical. And privately, they're often sending messages to their Australian counterparts saying that they're quite happy to see Australia acquire this capability and they can see the strategic logic behind it. Then you've got countries that are a little bit cautious or in some cases uneasy about what Australia is doing. And in particular, countries like Indonesia, which responded in quite a hostile fashion at first to AUKUS. Over time, it's become a little bit more temperate in its language and concerns. And then countries like Malaysia, which remains very uneasy about the prospect of Australia acquiring this capability, and which has issued a press release just a few days ago, basically making it clear that they still don't believe it's a good idea. They're worried about it fueling an arms race in the region. And then, of course, finally, you've got China, which remains outright opposed. It's the only country in the region, really, that has actually fiercely criticised the proposal, but Beijing sees AUKUS as aimed firmly at it, aimed entirely at Australia and the US. It basically sees it as an attempt by the US to bring Australia into its broader strategic posture and into its attempts to contain China. Beijing, as we know, has been fiercely critical of AUKUS. It's continuing to criticise it, and I think we can safely anticipate that it's going to do everything possible it can at places like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and at the UN to try and frustrate progress on AUKUS.
So that leaves Australia having to work doubly as hard to reassure countries in the region of its intentions with this new submarine deal. Just how concerned is it about what other countries think?
Oh, look, I think Australia is quite concerned about the possible blowback from AUKUS. It's been deeply concerned ever since the deal was first announced 18 months ago. And it saw both Indonesia and Malaysia, two of our closest and most important neighbours, respond so angrily. Now, that response was partly fuelled by a sense of anger in both, Kuala Lumpur and in Jakarta, that they'd been blindsided, that Australia should have looped them in earlier rather than developing this plan in top secrecy. But it also sort of pointed to the fact that in Southeast Asia there is unease about ratcheting up of tensions, about the fact that both China and the United States increasingly seem to be intent on forcing countries to choose, not something that anyone or any countries in Southeast Asia want to do. And of course, if there is a conflict between the United States and China, God forbid, an actual hot war, then the consequences for Southeast Asia in particular would be absolutely catastrophic. Even if it's short of a full nuclear war. So Southeast Asia is not necessarily going to welcome instinctively something like Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, and that's why the government's been working so assiduously to try and calm them. And to point out the strategic rationale. There's also a bit of frustration, it has to be said, in Canberra about the fact that Southeast Asian nations have not been particularly vocal about China's own massive military build-up, which has been huge and also opaque. Canberra, officials will say behind closed doors things like, well, Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia complain a lot about Australia's acquisition of conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines, but don't say anything about nuclear-powered Chinese submarines, some armed with nuclear weapons traversing the region. So there's a level of tension there. In the Pacific, yeah, it's also quite difficult, and that's partly because the Pacific has strong anti-nuclear credentials. Many Pacific nations have suffered devastating impacts from, in particular, US and UK nuclear testing in the 50s and 60s, and that legacy is a painful one for the Pacific. Now, Australia is not acquiring nuclear weapons, but even nuclear-powered submarines is not something that Pacific nations instinctively are going to welcome, and that's why Australia has been working so hard to try and reassure them about what it's doing and why it's doing it. Now, the fact that no Pacific nations have come out and actually criticised this deal, at least so far, is probably a marker of a level of success. But I don't think we should necessarily mistake silence in the Pacific for happy acquiescence. There will still be reservations in many Pacific Island nations, even if they're not in any position or don't feel like they want to pick any sort of public fight with Australia over the subject.
Well, there's a lot of work to do where China is concerned. Ties had been warming. How much of a setback to relations do you think this is for Australia-China ties?
Look, I don't think that this will necessarily set back Australia-China ties in a serious way. I think, and look, it's difficult to be certain, but I think that it's very likely that China has already baked in AUKUS into its calculus. After all, the announcement earlier this week wouldn't have taken Beijing by surprise in any way. It's known about this for 18 months. It probably confirms what China has already suspected for a long time, which is that Australia and the United States are going to continue to not only consult very, very closely, but to a certain extent, strategically, they're going to be very much on the same page. Australia, there is a very real prospect, in the event of conflict, that Australia could potentially enter that on the side of the United States. So I don't think that there'd necessarily be any sense of shock in Beijing over this. I think it's probably a reminder of just how divergent, in the end, Australia and China's interests are. But clearly, China has decided to press on with this diplomatic thaw, irrespective of the fact that Australia is going to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. It clearly sees compelling reasons for that and for turning down the temperature. And we haven't seen any evidence of China, for example, trying to reintroduce any trade bans or anything like that this week. Quite the contrary, we saw final confirmation this week that China is now really opening itself up once again to larger amounts of Australian coal exports. So there is a clear strategic calculus that China is pursuing. It is for its own reasons, trying to normalise the relationship with Australia. I don't think AUKUS will set that back in any substantive way, but it will act as a powerful reminder, I suspect, to China and to Canberra that this process of rapprochement, whilst valuable, can only go so far. In the end, Australia and China are not going back to where they were in, say, 2012, 2013 or 2014. The broader strategic outlook has deteriorated, and that means, to some extent, Australia and China are going to be on very different pages for the foreseeable future.
Stephen Dziedzic, thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne.